I'm Dr. Delores Blackwell, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of New York and some other places. And I have a whole bunch of other things going on. But I had to say that I'm seeing something weird happening on the screen. Okay. I have to say that this is my passion subject. And the reason why this is, first of all, anyone who's ever been in any of my presentations, some who were there last week or a couple of weeks ago, etc., everything seems to be passionate with me. But I promise you, this has a heightened level of passion because I spent years working on this because this population was the focus of my PhD. So I am like so excited whenever I have an opportunity to talk about the population, challenges that come up and working with the population, etc. And so today we're going to do some broad strokes work, okay? We're going to talk about folk who have past or present justice involvement. And when we lean into that, there's so many complexities that are attached to this. And so one, this presentation will be approximately 2 hours or a little less. And two, it is absolutely not enough time because there are so many different moving pieces to working with folks with past or present justice involvement. So let me start with just kind of talking a little bit about what is considered justice involvement. While we understand that there are folks who may come to the space who may have some sort of mandate, we call them mandates, and I'm going to share my slide deck in a moment, who may have some sort of mandates, we need to really be thoughtful about what that means, okay? So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to talk about folk who may be involved with probation, parole, who may have been released from jails and or facilities, etc. And so we're going to lean into that conversation. So that's the group of folk we're going to be talking about today, okay? So I'm going to share my slide deck and just let you know that there will probably be many things that I will be talking about that are not on the slide deck because like I just get into it like that. But also you will get a copy of the slide deck as well. So feel free to just kind of sit and be present for this conversation. Just sit and be present for the conversation, okay? And so give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get into this stuff and we're going to rock and roll with this conversation. Okay, let me just move where I'm seeing people because it's weird. Give me 1 second. Let me just move this over there. Awesome sauce. Okay, so can folks see my screen? Somebody give me a yay, nay. Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much. I'm going to enhance it larger. Okay, so as I indicated, working with clients with past or present justice involvement. And so Katie went over this information, and this is really how you can connect to the Opioid Response Network. And this is who is co-sponsoring this training with Healthy Capital. So that's cool. And so that's the information there. So if you didn't get the information when Katie talked about it, you'll have another opportunity to email to ask for or ask questions, etc. Okay, so you'll receive that. So today's objectives that again, for my liking, there's not enough time, is understanding the impact of justice involvement within a person-centered care framework, okay? Person-centered care framework, discuss the assumption, the association of trauma. There is something that we need to lean into on every level as it relates to trauma and past and present justice involvement. There is no way that we can have this conversation around the population without discussing trauma. And so it's actually in many ways connected to the last presentation we did around, I think it was it trauma-informed care and recovery planning, right? Okay, so it's actually connected, okay? We're going to identify the role of trauma on recovery planning in broad strokes, and also how to talk with or work with clients with challenging restrictions of justice involvement. Now, the thing about working with folks with justice involvement, particularly folks who are currently involved in probation and parole is that while different departments may have different philosophies about the work that needs to happen or they would like to happen, courts included, with folk, that we also need to deal with the individual parole officer, the individual probation officer, et cetera. And so how do we do that in a way that is person-centered, respects the person's ability to choose, and also maintain our programmatic integrity and our integrity in the work that we're doing with folks? Because a lot of what we're doing, in fact, all of what we're doing is under that foundation is self-determination, choice. And so when we talk about person-centered care, those are the key parts of the framework, okay? And so some of this is going to feel like a reminder for some folks. For some folks, this is the first time that they're hearing about person-centered care. But in order to build out the framework, let's lean into this just a bit, okay? So person-centered care means a process for planning and supporting individuals receiving services, or the individual receiving services, that builds upon the individual's capacity to engage in activities to promote community life and honors the individual's preferences, choices, and abilities. It moves beyond just the mandated challenges that somebody may come in with, but also brings all of their challenges to bear, okay? When we are talking about framing it in that context, we're talking about when folks who are justice involved, they may have certain mandates, et cetera, that they're coming in with, okay? And for many, that's their first focus. I just want to get this done so I can be done with this, right? Or I want to meet that restriction. I want to meet the court expectations, et cetera. One of the ways that we actively engage folks is, okay, absolutely, that's a goal. But is there other things you'd like to work on in our work together, right? And so that's one way of beginning to build that relationship, okay? Build the relationship. Now, just a little bit of an additional component when we talk about person-centered care and the therapeutic alliance, right? The therapeutic alliance that we're engaging folks with is the goals that we're working on together collaboratively, right? It is the tasks that each of us are agreeing to work with folks with, but also it's the bond, okay, that relationship. And that's one of the keys in working with justice involved folk, is building a relationship that is not just focused on a mandate, not just focused on their justice involvement, okay? And also considers the challenges that have arisen because of their involvement with the justice system in a variety of different ways, okay? So that's the framing of that context, okay? Am I being too passionate? I feel like I'm like, whoo, all over. So I'm sorry if I am, but again, this is such a passion project for me. And so the responsible counselor or provider or whomever is providing the services shall ensure that the person-centered planning process is used to develop a written plan of services in partnership or collaboration with the client and the mandated entity if possible. Now, the reason why I say the mandated entity if possible, right? If it's the courts, probation, parole, et cetera, is that, you know, the individual, the client may have some challenges with involving the probation or parole officer, right? It's like, I just want to keep this separate, okay? And we respect that. So we respect HIPAA, right? We respect that. But also, let's be honest, and I hope there's no probation or parole officers on this presentation, but you know what? Sometimes it's really difficult to get in touch with folks to involve them in the collaborative process. And this is a collaborative process. This is not about, or should not be about, okay, we're going to develop the plan and then call. It's about a series of case conferences, et cetera, that include all of the providers, including the mandated entity as a part of this conversation. So some of the goals or some person-centered treatment can look at goal setting should reflect individual decision-making or should reflect shared decision-making. Sorry, I live near a hospital, so that might come up every once. I apologize. Shared decision-making, informed choices. One of the things that I will say to you is that when you're working with justice-involved folk, depending upon where they're coming from. So let's say, for example, someone is coming from a facility, or I'm calling it facility, but we could talk about the prison system etc. Probation, parole, we can actually include all of that. That there may be this sense of I have to do what they say I have to do, right? And that they can look different. It could be the court, it could be the probation officer, the parole officer. That's one piece. The other piece of this can be that if someone has been released from incarceration, where they return to the community from incarceration, depending upon, actually not even depending, if someone has been incarcerated, they are given very clear directions into how they move within that environment, right? There's not choices, okay? And so we have to lean into the premise that folks may feel stripped of their choices when they have been moved from a facility and they come to the community. So we have to lean into that as well, informed choices, that when we're talking about HIPAA forms and we're talking about choices, et cetera, that we also have to take the time and lean into the potential consequences of the potential that folks may not feel like they have informed choices, okay? Because of a variety of different things that have happened while they've been incarcerated or while they've been involved with the justice system, right? So we need to be very, very clear about that and be very, very thoughtful about when we talk about informed choices, it's not just going through the forums, really talking with folks about what does that look like? What would you like to share? What would you not like to share, et cetera, okay? So each individual should also be informed of the comprehensive array of available services. They should be informed of everything, including medication, behavioral approaches, and this depends upon the different environments that folks find themselves in. And also the multidisciplinary team maintains a professional role by informing treatment planning and assuming ultimate responsibility for the plan, right? Because that's something that we also have to bend into that or lean into that as well. So the other piece of this is that individuals should be informed of the reporting requirements if they are justice involved. And so this is really, really key, because if someone is involved with probation or parole or the courts, really leaning into and figuring out what those challenges are, what those mandates, et cetera, are, right? What is your responsibility to report? And talking that through with the client, okay? Talking that through with the client. The best case scenario, I will tell you, is doing this in a case conference with the client, with the mandating entity, and you and other members of the treatment team. That's the perfect sauce to this, the perfect way of pulling this together, but it can be challenging. So there are a lot of different kind of ways you may need to do this, such as, okay, the next time you go to your parole officer or meet your parole officer, do you feel comfortable in calling your parole officer while you're in the office with me or while you're in the office with them? So that way we can do this in a collaborative way, okay? And generally that conversation, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, and I'm jumping ahead probably because I'm so passionate about this, is that you talk about what are the expectations, what your role is, et cetera, but also the requirements, so that the person who you're working with is very clear on what your requirements are. And then also you get a sense of whether your particular program, space that you're working in is able to fulfill those requirements, okay? Because we also need to take that in consideration as well, okay? And we know that person-centered treatment is evidence-based, strength-based, and non-punitive. Non-punitive, coercive in language, okay? Non-punitive and coercive in language. Okay. So person-centered practice, just a quick review, paying attention to the latent content and listen to what people are really saying, what someone is really saying, okay? And being genuine with your reactions and avoid, accept the negative emotions, okay? And identify when potential stigma around the client's justice involvement has come into the room, okay? Folks experience stigma and bias related to their justice involvement, okay? It can be internalized stigma or it can be actual stigma. We also need to be aware of our own bias as it relates to working with and engaging with folks who are involved in justice involvement, okay? Now, this is where my research comes in, okay? And I'm going to add a little bit of flavor to this. There, depending upon a number of different factors, folks have talked about, well, I'll give you a little bit of context. So my dissertation focused on working with about 900 practitioners across the country. I was very lucky to get that sample, and it really leaned into, do folks have challenges in working with justice-involved individuals? And it really leaned into this premise of, do you have bias? Do you have stigma? What are some of the things that come up for you? And how that can then play a role in developing an alliance, okay? And you would be surprised that yes, as much as we engage in person-centered practice, that all of us have thoughts and feelings and ideas related to folks who have come through the justice system or are currently involved in the justice system. So being aware of when that comes into the room is incredibly important, and moving it out of the room. So really, when you're engaging in person-centered practice with the population, really thinking about, is this me or is this something that's happening in the space? And how do I distinguish between the two? And so this is the importance of supervision, et cetera, okay? Peer supervision and one-on-one supervision. Also, being cognizant of the tone and language are both equally important, okay? The tone and language, the language of, are we still calling folks criminally justice involved folks? So like, that's not, being thoughtful around, what does that mean for the person who's hearing that? The firm kind of space that we are now, justice involved folks, and that encompasses a wide swath of folk. So some of the key characteristics of person-centered practice include congruence, positive regard, empathy, non-directness, reflection of feelings, and definitely asking those open-ended questions, and active listening and engagement. And we're going to lean a little bit more into this a little later. I think outcomes and how progress is achieved towards those outcomes is measured, et cetera. And I want to key into the roles and the responsibilities of the individual, the supports, everyone who's involved, including the mandated entity in implementing this plan, and really being clear about what this looks like, okay? Really being clear and engaging as many folks as possible in this planning is key. One of the challenges that many folks who work with justice-involved folks will say is, I don't know how to talk with mandated entities. I don't know how to talk with the courts, or the level of comfort, because it is a bit of a different language when you're engaging folks, okay? It's a bit of a different language, okay? And so being very thoughtful about how do you navigate that is also incredibly important, okay? Again, I could talk about this for hours, okay? So let's lean into some of the very specific work around principles of work with justice-involved clients. So SAMHSA has done some good work around this in regards to some principles to think about when working with justice-involved clients that really provide us with a great foundation to continue this conversation. Now, some of the language that you will see, because this is a direct quote from SAMHSA, is a direct quote language, okay? And so being thoughtful about switching that language when appropriate. So one of the things that SAMHSA indicates in regards to their principles is community providers are knowledgeable about the criminal justice system. And this includes the sequence of events, the terminologies and processes of the criminal justice system, as well as the practices of the criminal justice professionals. They also talk about community providers collaborate with criminal justice professionals to improve public safety and individual behavioral health outcomes, okay? And we're gonna lean into this in a few minutes, so I'm just kind of rolling these out, okay? So another key point is integrating physical and behavioral health, including addiction care as a part of the comprehensive treatment plan. And services and workplaces are trauma-informed to support the health and safety of both justice-involved individuals and community providers. And also community providers recognize and address the issues that contribute to the disparities in behavioral health care in the criminal justice system, okay? And at the end of the slide deck, when you receive the slide deck, you'll receive the reference. You'll see the reference to lean into this document even further, okay? So you'll have an opportunity to read the document. So let's lean into some of these principles and really kind of deconstruct them. So community providers are knowledgeable about the criminal justice system. So when we think about the terminology, when someone is involved with the justice system, right, we have to think about every point of entry. The actual beginning point of entry is when they have contact with law enforcement. Okay, when they have contact with law enforcement, that's the first point of entry. And thinking about the impact of what that means along those different points. Okay, so we have folks who may have had contact with law enforcement in regards to an arrest and may have been given a desk appearance ticket. We have folks who may have been arrested, gone through what we call central booking in some spaces, and then may be in a jail system, okay? The jail system generally tends to be, in most jurisdictions, the jail system can be someone's taken downstairs in central booking, and or they are transported to a jail in the community. Now, jails generally tend to hold folk up to a year. If somebody is given a year and a day after sentencing, then they may be transported to a different facility, okay? Now, once someone is transported to that different facility, that is once they have been sentenced to a particular length of time, and when they are about to re-enter society, then they may be given a parole hearing, okay? They are going to be given a parole hearing, okay? So we have the beginning when someone is arrested, we have when someone is booked, okay? We have when someone goes to court, all right? Then they may be sentenced, and once they are sentenced, if they're sentenced in less than a year, they may be in a jail setting, or if they are sentenced to a year and a day, or anything over a year, they may be going to a state facility, okay? Now, if someone is involved or sent to a state facility when they are re-entering, then they will be given parole. Okay, so that's parole. Okay, and that's a different system than probation. Okay, so just being clear about who you're dealing with along the way. Okay, so the person may be involved with the courts because there is alternative to incarceration programs or ATI, right? So in that regard, you may be working directly with a court to help them get through their mandate, etc. And the ATI programs, generally, if someone completes an ATI program, they either have lesser charges or their charges are completely wiped. Okay, there's a number of different ways that happens. We also have the specialized courts. So there are mental health treatment courts, there are drug courts, and that's their name. We have domestic violence courts, we have veterans courts, etc. And this very much depends upon the jurisdiction in which you find yourself. And so kind of getting yourself familiar with all of this is incredibly important, because that way you're having a conversation with the client and you're able to talk through this, because there's navigation through all of these systems, right? You navigate through the court differently than you navigate with parole, than you navigate with probation, okay? Now, someone who is in court can be given probation. They can be sentenced to probation, which is different than parole, okay? And so what Samsha kind of lays out there, and I highly recommend, is that as you really lean into working with the population, that you become familiar with the terminology and the processes as much as you can, okay? Because there's different things that are happening along that process. And honestly, a part of providing person-centered care is being able to provide support in navigating the various subsystems, okay? How do I help the client, or how do I help my client navigate parole? How do I help them navigate probation? How do I help them navigate the courts, okay? So that's one piece, okay? The other piece is if someone is, we also have to acknowledge the trauma of those different points of entry, the recurring trauma that occurs when folks have to reconnect with their parole officer each week or each month, etc. All of these things are a part of this conversation. That's why this is something that we can talk about for hours, okay? Does anybody have any questions about that or any thoughts about it? Let me check the chat. Okay. Okay, doesn't look like anyone has any questions, so I'm going to move us forward, if that's okay. All right. And some of this feels like, oh, this feels so dry, but it really is important, okay? It really is important, okay? So, next principle. Community providers collaborate with criminal justice professionals to improve individual behavioral health outcomes. Now, for the purposes of SAMHSA is embedding under behavioral health outcomes. That's addiction care, that's mental health care, etc. That's all under behavioral health. Now, this one can be really challenging because there's a variety of different things that come up for folk in regards to how do I talk to folks in the court, or if they've had a challenging experience with someone who is engaged in parole, etc. It can be really challenging. And this was one of the significant factors that came up for practitioners in my work, okay? How do I even talk to these folks? Because it's a different language, right? It's a different language. And really, it's something that you really have to kind of learn to navigate and to really lean into the terminology, etc. I will say that I was very lucky, and what kind of led to me even doing my dissertation on this is that I worked in the court system and I also worked for corrections. So I have to admit that I had some sense of the language to use, okay? And that's a whole other different conversation of the language to use, etc. And so we can definitely lean into that just a bit for today, because I want to open it up to ask if anyone has any questions or any concerns when they're engaging collaborators in the justice system. Have they engaged or attempted to engage the courts, etc.? And what has that felt like when they did it? And you can feel free to unmute yourself if you have some feedback. Carrie, is there anything in the chat?
You're muted, Carrie.
Sorry about that. I was just sharing that someone commented that it's very hard to gain trust in the system. And then someone else commented that as someone who's coming from a corrections officer to now offering help to those who I saw on the other side can be particularly challenging.
Absolutely, absolutely. Building trust. And I just wanted to circle back to the person who said building trust or mentioned building trust. Is that building trust with the person that you're working with, or building trust with the professional who is involved in the justice space? So I just wanted to make sure before I commented.
And feel free to take yourself off mute as well if you want to.
Jump in. This is an open conversation.
Yeah. Somebody else just also commented how it's especially hard to gain trust with high-risk clients. And someone else just commented that they find it difficult to help probation officers understand how a mental health condition factors into the choices that the person is making.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And, it's something that you have to consistently revisit, right? And with the understanding that each person has a different role, okay? And that might be part of what the challenge is as well. And we're going to go through that in a second. Let me see if I need to jump ahead a little bit, because I want to make sure I'm hearing where folks are. And then I also want to be very thoughtful around the person who mentioned that they moving from being a correction officer to changing professions. And then what does that look like? Because you've now moved from one role to another. And I can tell you, it can be really challenging because you're kind of indoctrinated in that role to operate a certain way with folks. And then you have to really do a lot of work consistently to switch that role to something else. And definitely it's something I definitely hear you and understand. And I wonder if you
Yes.
wanted to talk about
Oh.
that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to tap into that a little bit because I've been faced with so many challenges, in part because I guess maybe it's difficult for them to trust me because they saw me in a different light, some of them. They think that because, which, you know, as a correction officer, I was never one to be that statistic that most people assume that because you're a correction officer, you're hard, you're this, you're that, you have no respect for the people. I've always been one who, you know, you get treated the way you treat me. Simple. That's the way I ran my floor, if you will. And now that I'm on the other end of it, I don't know how they got wind of it. I know some of the people that are in the facility that I'm in now. I don't know if they remember me. I certainly don't remember them because I see so many people passing through the jails, so it's difficult to remember every face. But they certainly remember you, right? Because it's 1/51 inmates, if you will. I'm sorry, incarcerated individuals, because that's the new language. I do apologize. I come from a time where it was inmates, so I don't mean to be insensitive when I'm saying that. However, now that I'm in a different environment, now that they remember who I am, you know, they're a little more reluctant to, you know, I guess maybe open up, let me know what's going on, you know, and in some cases they even, you know, cursed at me, you know, they make it, you know, almost difficult for me to want to do my job, you know, because I'm so passionate about it, you know, I choose to ignore it, but you know, it has had its challenges where I'm like, I don't even know if I could keep going because, and the environment I'm in, you know, they can openly drink, they can still engage in alcohol and so on and so forth. So they're angry and then they're inebriated and then, you know, so it's just like a chemical reaction, I guess, of sorts. And so for me, I'm just having a hard time kind of like gaining that moment with them where I'm like, listen, I'm not here against you. I'm here with you. I'm here to get you through that challenge. You know, whoever, you know, you thought I was or whoever you think I am, that's not who I am. I'm someone who's standing in front of you with an opportunity for you, you know? And even when I was in the correctional facility, that's what the facility is for correction, right? To correct the behavior. And so it's not because I'm here because I want to tell you what to do, but you're in a position where something went wrong and now we need to correct that behavior. And this is how we go about correcting that behavior. Anyway, I just wanted to share that little tidbit because, I was going through some stuff. So this is why I picked this as one of my classes so that way I could better understand how to move forward with them.
Thank you so very much for sharing that. And it's just powerful. I definitely have some empathy in regards to some of the challenges. And the thing, one thing, and you probably know this, so it may just feel like a reminder to you, like once one person identifies your identity, it kind of is shared with everyone, right? And that's one piece. But the other piece is that, in a particular system, right? What happens in a system, we need to kind of think it through or remind ourselves almost consistently that this particular population has been through a brutal system, okay? A system that has traditionally brutalized folks. And when I say brutalized folks, I'm talking about the variety of different things, okay? And so when you are connected to a system, and we just happen to be talking about the justice system right now, but we could be talking about any system. When we are connected to a system where folks have had negative interactions with, that folks have been hurt by, physically, emotionally, the gamut, right? When we are identified with that system, it is absolutely, absolutely more challenging to develop a rapport with folk and a bond with folk and to develop the trust. I hear what you're saying. I hope that you are receiving supervision, but also taking care of yourself in this as well, because part of this can feel I hear that, and I hope that I'm not misreading that, and please let me know. I hear the personal nature of it and how it's impacting you. And so I would, ask that you kind of really lean into the self-care process, and really engage in supervision, engage in peer supervision, etc., and kind of frame it in that context. There's so much more I want to say. Like, I'm almost like, I need you to, I almost like, give me your name and number so I can talk to you further. Because I had a very similar challenge, so I understand. But I definitely wanted to thank you for talking about something that folks don't talk about. Okay. Or might be worried to, or might be anxious to expose to folks, that they're feeling a particular way in working with the population, or the population is responding to them in a particular way. Okay. I also see someone, and I hope that was helpful. Please let me know if it was.
There's a bunch of chat, talking about just how incredibly important it is, the relatability factor, the terminology and language.
And I see Helen with her hand raised, and I wanted to give space for that.
Oh, please call me Skip. I'm sorry, I should have changed.
Hi, how you doing?
Everybody knows I should have changed my name. Hello, everyone. My name is Skip. I am the executive director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative. And what we do is push forward the idea that those with lived experiences should now be looked at as having lived expertise. Speaking to the former corrections officer, I have 2 former corrections officers on my team who do training and peer support for justice-involved individuals. Now, here's the thing. The current iteration of the system is very clinical. And I am not saying particularly, I am against the clinical iteration. I am justice involved. I spent 25 years going in and out. I'm now an academic, as I am in grad school, moving toward my PhD in criminology. Not saying that the clinical model is not efficient or not working. What I'm saying is that this model needs to expand and incorporate the voices of those with lived experiences. But then when you look at that catchphrase, lived experiences, it just kind of like stays there at lived experiences. But we are past lived experiences. What we need to recognize is that lived experiences is lived expertise. And if we can move past that barrier and consider that as expertise, those of us who have lived experiences in these systems will be looked upon as professional and vital to the transformation of the criminal justice system. So let me just throw a slight little thing in here. As the executive director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative, we're having our next annual conference in June. And the tag phrase for the conference is moving lived experiences to lived expertise. So we all have lived experiences. As sorry, Delores, I don't know if you're a New York resident, but as a New York resident, we are all peers. As a New York City resident, we are all peers. Whenever I talk about being a peer and having lived experiences, I'm a peer because I live in New York City, which means I bought a MetroCard that failed. I've stood at a bus stop in the rain waiting for the bus to come, and I'm in the shelter. And for some reason, the bus driver always pulls up ahead of the shelter So we still have to run out the shelter and run to the bus. You know what I'm saying? It's the common shared experiences that make us peers. And I just hope that when you do work with justice involved clients, if you have any semblance of lived experience, that you have moved to lived expertise, that you let that be first and foremost and not rely solely on the clinical model. It takes a village, and we need to come at this from all angles. But that's my piece. I just wanted to jump in and say that. Carrie.
No worries, and no worries, and thank you for that, because the thing about building a bond, the thing about building a relationship is connecting to someone's humanity, right? Connecting to someone's humanity. And when we think about it from that aspect, right? Even though we've labeled it person-centered care, client-centered care, all of these different things, it's connecting to that person and working with that person collaboratively to help them meet the goals that they want to meet, right? And so one of the key components of that is being open to all of what that looks like. The folks that we work with, whether they're justice involved or not, they're the best experts in their lives and what's happened for them and where they would like to go, etc. And so we have to open that space to that and remind ourselves of that consistently. Okay, that's a part of this work. That's why I said this could literally, I could spend hours talking about this, hours, and tap into also the component that folks who are specifically justice involved in many spaces and places have been told that they don't have that right, or they don't have those options, or that's been indoctrinated that they don't have options. And part of our responsibility, a big part of our responsibility is, yes, you do. You do have options. Yes, we are working together. This is not me telling you anything. This is us working together. What do you want to do? What do you want to do? Okay, and so that's kind of leaning into all of that. Okay, it's okay if I move forward because I feel like, wow, we're at 9:53. I got to cover some more stuff. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so the lines of communication. So when we begin to talk about or leaning into folks who are justice involved, how are we communicating? How are we pulling this all together? Again, this is, how do we help folks navigate that conversation? How do we include everyone in that conversation as best as we can? And if they don't want to be included, if we get on the phone and we try to reach out to a parole officer and the parole officer doesn't reach out to us, okay, did we try? Okay, that's one. But two, I'm going to remind, and actually one is remembering that even though someone is justice involved, and yes, they are involved in the courts, etc., they still have the right, they absolutely have the right to say, I don't want my parole officer involved. I don't want my probation officer involved, etc. Absolutely. We really need to remind folks of that, because in my work, I found that there were folks who felt comfortable with using something called therapeutic reporting. Gotta remember if that's the word, therapeutic reporting, where folks would use the fact that someone felt comfortable. And of course, I don't know who these people are exactly because it's sample size, right? That they felt comfortable in saying, well, if you don't do this, then I'm going to have to contact your parole officer or your probation officer. And that was one of the more interesting findings, how many folks felt comfortable doing that. And so we need to lean into that premise as well. Okay, that just feels the complete antithesis of person-centered, of respecting folks and building a rapport in a relationship. Okay, so we really need to be thoughtful around that. And so when we talk about the lines of communication, it's the provider, and I'm using the provider, could be anyone, the mandating entity, which can be anyone, the courts, probation, parole, and the client. Okay, that's the line of communication, and you see that they're all connected. There's no separate conversations with the provider and the mandating entity. Okay, all of this is pulled together. And again, this is something that you will have to work at, and that there are times that when you attempt to do this, you will be more successful than others. Okay, so just kind of leaving with that foundation or that kind of premise. Recognizing that each one has a role, right? Each one has a role. So you have the provider who, and I'm calling it provider, but the provider can be anyone. Okay, the provider, anyone who's having the contact, and the mandated entity can be anyone. And recognizing who plays what role. And when you're kind of leaning into who plays what role, it helps to kind of remind you or to help you understand why contacts may look a particular way. So we as providers are providing care consistent with the knowledge in the field, identifying goals collaboratively with the client to develop plans to get to the goals. We're encouraging and supporting folk. We're providing information. We're listening with compassion, etc. But the mandating entity, whomever they are, while they have some correlated roles, they also have specific things that they need to do as well. Okay, and so then how do we navigate that? How do we collaborate with that is something that's key. So we know that mandating entities obtain an agreement on responsibilities and tasks to achieve, monitor compliance with the agreement to encourage success, and support public, family safety, etc. All of those things are mandated entities, are part of their responsibilities. And so thinking about how do we navigate that? How do we manage to assist the client or the person to navigate how this all looks is going to be something that you consistently have to look at and work on, okay? This is not a one-off conversation. And so here's some of the things that you want to think about when you're having that conversation, when you get on the phone with the court or you get on the phone with the probation, parole office, etc., is understanding the mandating entity's expectation of the client, right? Because while we are definitely framing this in the context of clients are the best expert of their experience, etc., they are also involved with a system that they may need to meet particular expectations. And I don't know, about other folks, but I know I have come across multiple clients who've said, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing or how long I'm supposed to be doing this. Okay. And so it's like, let's get on the phone. Are you okay with getting on the phone? Let's get on the phone with the courts. Let's get on the phone with probation. Let's talk about this and figure this all out. Okay. Also, the conversation around education around the treatment approach or the strategies, addressing any challenges. Now, let's lean into the premise of harm reduction, because that is something that is used particularly in New York State, across the country. But I'm going to go with just New York State. Having that conversation with folks around harm reduction and educating folks around harm reduction, educating parole and probation officers around harm reduction, and the dissonance between what they may want for the client to do. Okay, that's a part of this conversation. That's a great example to kind of lean into. Okay, developing that collaborative relationship. Let's be honest here. Some folks are going to be easier to develop that collaboration with others. Okay, some folks are. So how does that look? And again, respecting the client's or the individual's thought process around this. Do they even want that collaboration? Okay, really being transparent about how all of this looks is key. Okay, reporting and case conferencing expectations. Now, for me, when I did this, a lot of this work, because I had the language, I was able to kind of negotiate with some folks to say, okay, is it possible for us to talk all together once a month, etc.? What would that look like? Sometimes you get that collaboration, sometimes you don't, but really leaning into it as best you can. And all of this should be held with the client present. Okay, no separate conversations. Okay, now there are times where someone may contact you back, etc., but you really want to lean into having everyone into that space, whether it's a virtual space, phone space, etc. Okay, because that also helps to build trust. Okay, any thoughts about any of this for anyone? Anything in the chat? Nope. Okay. Folks are just listening. Okay. All right. So next, moving back to the overarching principles of work with justice-involved clients, integrated physical and behavioral health care is a part of the comprehensive treatment plan for justice-involved individuals. For folks who have been moved from let's say, a state facility and coming back into the community, etc., the word reentry, being thoughtful around folks may not have received adequate physical and health care while they were involved in the justice system, while they were upstate, okay? When we even combine the combination of trauma into this, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, folks may not have felt comfortable going to the doctor or may not have received quality care, okay? So these are all things that we need to look at. And how do we bring that into the work with justice-involved folks that we're working with, okay? One of the things that you may need to work with folks around is figuring out how they're going to go to the dentist, how they're going to go to, let's say, for certain folks, the GYN. All of those different things can be a part of the treatment plan, okay? All those things can be a part of it. But again, a lot of this is identifying, sitting down with the person and identifying what it is that they need beyond this overarching mandate, okay? Okay, just kind of leaning into that a bit. All right. So I'm going back into the trauma space, okay? Everyone should understand that there are multiple forms of trauma that folks who have had engagement with law enforcement, who are involved with the court system, who have been incarcerated, who are under community supervision, probation and parole. There are various forms of trauma connected to whether it's past or present. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. Someone who may be navigating parole, okay? There is, of course, the connection between the sequence of events of the law enforcement involvement, coming through the court system. All of that is connected to trauma, okay? And then someone is released into the community under community support. Now they're on parole. Each time that person goes to the parole office, their trauma is potentially being reactivated. Okay, each time. So a part of this conversation is about how do you feel when you go to the parole office? What is, how can I support you around this? I've done whole sessions with folks just focused on this is how I felt when I went there. I saw somebody being violated and I was sitting there in fear. Or I feel as if when I go to the parole offices, I'm treated in a way that feels disrespectful. Okay? Being an open space to talk about all of this is a part of really leaning into the trauma-informed care approach. Okay.
Earlier, Dr. Blackwell, Maria had put in the comments about how the correctional settings and the psychiatric facilities are using the corrections model. And I'm just thinking about it and how it creates, a lot more traumas. And also how Maria highlighted how now our psychiatric facilities are getting overwhelmed with not only the needs of the general population, but also especially the needs of the criminal justice involved population, because they're underprepared to address some of those traumas. And then often, and I know Skip has spoke this before, there's added traumas from that experience. So I just wanted to throw that out there since that was part of the chat earlier and speaks to a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's just something that we need to consistently be open to bringing into the room and talking about and processing. Because one of the key components of our work with Justice Involved folks is providing support. And so by providing support is when you go to the parole office, let's talk about some strategies to get you through that. Okay, how do you feel about that? What have you tried in the past? What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you, etc. A lot of this again goes back to that relationship, that bond, and being open to talk about what this looks like for folk. Okay, and hearing what they say, connecting the emotions, and not kind of short-circuiting the emotions that folks have, but creating a space for them to feel safe to express it. Okay, it's a major part of this. Okay. Being prepared for the impact of trauma at the multiple points that folks come in contact with the justice system will have an impact on the formation and maintenance of the Helpful Therapy Alliance. This is not something that we can ignore. Okay, and so folks may feel uncomfortable, etc., leaning into that and figuring out how you can create a space where that conversation happens is key. And so if it's something that you feel like, hey, I don't feel like I'm prepared to deal with, if I ask these questions, I'm prepared to deal with this. What are the supports that you have in the organization or the spaces that you are in to help you work through feeling a heightened level of comfort around this? Because when we're working with the population, this is not something we can ignore. Just as we can't ignore when we're first initially beginning the conversation or folks are beginning to work with us, talking about how they feel if, let's say, for example, they're involved with the court or probation or parole, and there's a, they told me I have to come here. Okay, that's the huge element in the room, right? And so if you don't talk about it, it's like it's there. And even though you don't talk about it, it's not going anywhere. It's going to intertwine in every contact that you have. So having the conversation is incredibly important. Okay, having the conversation from the beginning, throughout the time you're working with the person, etc., is key. Okay.
Dr. Blackwell, for someone who's just starting out working in this field and is looking for some guidance when they're supporting somebody who this is their first incarceration, what are some tips would you give them in terms of going into that conversation? So they're kind of new themselves, but also the person is brand new to the system and being incarcerated.
So I'm going to take a step back for a second, because the question that you're asking is not only a very important question, but also speaks to the level of training that folks receive in working with the population. Now, in my research, what I found is that folks, I focused on folks who were involved in the addiction field, right? What I found was that folks felt more comfortable, let's say we're working with someone around addiction, because they felt like they received training around that. But in working with clients with mandates or justice involvement, they felt completely like, I am not prepared to do this. There's not a lot of training. There's not a lot of supports out there. And over the years, it definitely has gotten better, but it's something that is an ongoing challenge. So what I would say is one key tip is the same way you would engage anyone in the conversation. How do you feel about coming here today? How do you feel about our work together? Okay. And then letting them, talk and their narrative and leaving space for that. And saying, you know what, I was wondering, I see that, you have some involvement with probation. I was wondering how you feel about that. What's what happens for you, or what does that look like for you? That open-ended question, and then allowing the response to happen. So many of the tools that we utilize, like open-ended questions, empathy, active listening, etc., are the same tools that we use with justice-involved clients. Here's the thing. When we talk about a particular population, we can have those conversations about a particular population. But here's the thing, everyone that we work with are human beings. And so how do we engage someone that we're working with as a human being? And then, of course, adding in, how do you feel about being involved with the justice system? Or how do you feel about being involved with parole? That is the #1 strategy that folks can use. Okay, just engaging folks as a human being, active listening, hearing where folks are, the empathy, asking open-ended questions, and listening to what the person has to say.
Excuse me, ma'am.
And accepting the emotions. Yes.
Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Veronica. Also, like when I worked with, I'm a AOT care manager where most clients are mandated. And I do see like with a lot of my peers or my supervisors will tell me when I be like, oh, they're not answering the phone. I'm struggling to get them to meet with them because they do re-entry from jail or psych. And the first thing they do say is, well, talk to their parole officer or talk to their probation officer. So it's just crazy you said that. And I'm not throwing nobody under the bus or anything like that. But that's the first thing they would tell me, you know, when I say, well, they're not answering because we do pickup orders. So when they don't meet with us, we do a pickup order. And to me, that's traumatizing because I have a 24-year-old has severe intellectual disability and bipolar. And since she was 10 years old, there was nights I didn't sleep. She wake up 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the street. Like I had to do these calls where they run in and they grab her, they put in the so it's not only I'm afraid for it to be traumatizing if I do it to somebody else, I'm afraid for it to be traumatizing to me, even though she's 24 now and I surpassed that. But I know how that feels. So I'm the type of person to where I will call them and it'd be something simple like, Miss Veronica, I just overslept. Now, what if I would have did what my supervisor said? Call the parole officer, do a pickup order, do all that when all I had to do was call them and I'm like, Timmy, I'm just making up a name. Timmy, what happened? You didn't go to your psychiatrist? Oh, Miss Veronica, I overslept. You know I wouldn't lie to you. Well, can we schedule another appointment? Well, I'll schedule it tomorrow. No, why don't we just do it together to help you out? And then we'll be on the phone and we'll do it together. But it's just crazy you said that because that's what my supervisors will say to me.
And thank you for sharing that because you're not throwing anyone under the bus. It absolutely happens. And it's unfortunate that there are a lot of spaces and places that's the first response. Call somebody, call the courts, call. And really, what does that really mean? One, it could be it absolutely is, not even potentially re-traumatizing, but also the example that was just given, where literally the person overslept. And so when you're engaging systems, right? Engaging systems, being thoughtful about if I pick up the phone and I call probation or parole, okay? If I pick up the phone and call probation and parole, what are the potential consequences of this? Okay, and talking that through, okay, is an important part of this. Because imagine you overslept. Using Veronica's example, you overslept and an entity comes knocking at your door. Sounds like somebody else wanted to say something.
Oh,
Sounds like somebody else wanted to say something. Okay. Is it
I'm
okay?
not sure if someone else did, but and we'll see if they unmute again. But I did want to also talk about something that's in the chat, which is also addressing real life situations. And first, also thank Veronica for sharing not only her experience hitting on vicarious trauma, but also giving her clients that space
Mhm.
an ability to say, hey, I overslept, and that is just such a good example of establishing trust, of meeting somebody where they're at, of being a fellow human being. So I just want to also bring it over to the chat where Hayden brought up a really valid real life example, which is where you have clients that are trying to do the work with the probation officers or other workers in their midst, but they might have unresolved issues or conflicts between them, and or they're not using trauma-informed care, person-centered language, etc., and don't seem open to that. So how do you assist and partner with a client in navigating systems where that's not the focus, and where you're using one language with them and then they have to appear with people who aren't using that same language and are able to build off those strengths?
Right, and it's absolutely, I mean, I kind of talk a little bit about this earlier, that there's a different language that happens. And so in that regard, we're providing support to the client and helping them to navigate it and to helping them process what's being said. Okay, so what does that look like? I went to my parole officer, I went to my probation officer, and this is how the probation officer spoke to me. Okay, or this is what they said, or this is what they told me I have to do, right? If you're having that ongoing conversation with the person, really leaning into, okay, oh, I remember you went to probation this week. How did that go? And having the conversation, well, I felt very disrespected, da 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 da, like whatever that looks like, and providing the support in that space. Because here's the thing, we can't control what a mandated entity says to a client when they engage them in the courts, probation, and parole. There is still such a significant amount of work that needs to be done within the justice system.
Yeah.
There
I
is
guess
so much work that needs to be done. We've made some strides, but there is still a heck of a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And while there are some conversations and spaces around trauma-informed care and integrating that into working with folks in justice involvement, whether it is probation, parole, etc., there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Yeah.
It looks like someone wanted to say something. Thought I heard somebody on mute.
Yeah, that was me that asked the question. I guess my question, less so than talking with the clients, it's more like when you're developing the relationships with like the actual people that are working in the institutions. Like, how do you talk to them about like, having them like making a partnership with them to like be where you're meeting the client? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, I absolutely do. And that's what I'm saying. You can't control
yeah,
how folks respond to that conversation. You can have the conversation. You can do some modeling maybe. There are also times where folks might be more open than others.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we can try to do psychoeducation. We can try to do modeling. We can even try to do the modeling in the case conference that we try to do, etc. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done for folks to really hear it, but implement it. And it's not on the provider. And I'm talking about when you're dealing with entities who are involved in the justice system. Okay.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I realize when I'm working with clients, they don't have like you said, not the education, but the skills to handle somebody that's re-entry. Another example is I had a client that was just come out of prison. I met with him. He had his first therapist psychiatric appointment. I went to the appointment. The psychiatrist kept on asking him, how you feel? We're just asking him question after question after question. He was getting irritable. So I noticed it. So I'm like, okay, what's the matter? Do you want to take a break? And I was like, what's going on? Like, what's going on with you right now? He was like, well, when I was in jail, it was traumatized for me because they would ask me questions and I didn't know the answer. And when I didn't know the answer, I got punished, So like after the meeting, we talked. I didn't pull his card in front of the psychiatrist, but I just knew something was off. So when I met with him after and I asked him that, and he was like, and he told me, so I said, so what you're saying to me is you don't like somebody to keep on asking you the same question over again or asking you a different question. When you say you don't know, it's not you being rude like somebody would take it. You just really don't know. He said yes. And he was like, that wasn't acceptable when I was in prison. So when I come
Veronica, you went on mute. Veronica, you went on mute.
doing treatment, you don't want that. You don't want that wall up, So I was like, all right, so let's call this psychiatrist together
There we
and
go.
and express it to him and sit down and I go with you. And if you can't express it, I'll express it. I mean, not express it for him, but, help him express it. You know what I mean? So we went to his next appointment. He meet every month, but we made an earlier appointment because I just see how it was just bothering him. And he was a very substance abuse addictive. So he would have went out and used if it wasn't addressed sooner than later. So I went to the psychiatrist next week and the psychiatrist understanding when I followed up with him after a month later, he said it's been better. So.
And that's the importance of peers. That's the importance of moving past any concerns we may have with engaging mandated entities and actually having the conversations. Because we're talking to the clients, but we also need to talk to the folks who are working with the clients, right? And with the recognition that, yes, in this particular example, which was amazing, that the psychiatrist was open to hearing that, but also recognizing that there may be times where the person may not be, and we may have to keep coming back. Okay. I wish we had like a magic wand to wave it when we hear folks not connecting to folks as human beings or not being aware, etc. But it's something that we consistently have to lean into when we're working with folks. Okay. I love peers. I absolutely adore having peers. Why? Because if I am working with someone and can't get to an appointment, it's like, let's connect someone with a peer or connect someone with a SERPA, whatever the terminology, because there's different terminologies in different spaces, so that they can go to that space accompanied by someone that can provide them with support. And have those conversations. Okay, so that's another strategy that you can utilize. Okay, is it okay if I move us forward? Yes, okay. I told you I could talk about this all day, and you guys are coming up with some amazing examples. I so appreciate it, and I wish.
And when one more thing, and when they're like, when I do have providers that like don't agree, I have that private conversation like with them. I don't get in like a power control, because sometimes you get in that power control who got more power over the client. You don't want to get in that power struggle, especially in front of the client. You want the client to know like you have that rapport. So I don't do it in front of the client, but if I do feel like it's going to intervene with all of us being cohesive with the client, I will give them a call so we can talk it out. You know what I mean? Because you got to be aware of your cultural differences, because it could be my cultural bias or some reason, or his cultural bias, and we have to come together. So I won't do it in front of the client, because it does happen.
Thank you, Veronica. And to add an additional piece to that, if that's okay, is you mentioned something about power and control. When we're having these conversations, we also have to be aware of the potential impact on the client. Let's just be honest about that. That if a client is involved with the justice system, that we want to try to navigate and collaborate as much as we can. But we also want to, at our best, try to avoid a confrontational relationship with folks. because at the end, the client is in the middle. Okay, Carrie, I see.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the chat, there was another point of view, that we haven't really talked much about, which is on the flip side for the probation officer that is hearing from over and over clients, I overslept, she was referenced the COVID, that I couldn't complete my community service because of COVID. And the probation officer was like, well, you never asked me, if that's okay. Or you never asked me if there were other places that were open. And that assumptions and like, how do you get, or assist even, how in your role, whether that's probation officer, MSW, CPP, CPS or SERPA, how can you facilitate getting the probation officer to see the individual as an individual as opposed to part of a larger problem that they may be addressing?
Wow.
Mm-hmm. That's why I paused about addressing it right now. So I'm like, maybe I should save this for the end.
Yes, because it's a tough one, because we're talking about directly confronting systems that in a lot of different ways don't operate in the same system that we do. Okay, and it's not about necessarily the people who are in the system, because there's folks who are amazing in these systems, but there are also, we also have to recognize the impact of the organizational system itself and how folks are trained to interact with folk. Okay, so there's a lot of different moving pieces there. Okay, so a probation officer is trained on how to interact with folk. Okay, depending on who trained them, et cetera, what trainings, et cetera, they connected to, that's how they may interact with folk. Then they may bring in their own kind of additional kind of thought processes, training, et cetera. And then they add to that, okay? One of the things I just want to remind folks, and I definitely need to move us forward because we're like 10:27, that while we're working with probation, parole officers, et cetera, that they are also folks who are human beings as well, who have challenges as well, who are navigating the systems that they're located in as well. And so figuring out where are those moments that we can collaborate, hopefully successfully, is always going to be something you're going to need to be on the lookout for. Okay? Because again, I've worked with amazing parole officers, amazing probation officers who should have been social workers. Okay? And I've also worked with some that have had some challenges. But the goal was to help the client navigate that so that they could successfully navigate and finish and end the stipulations. Okay? And sometimes, yes, you have to bite your tongue. Okay? And I also want to be fair and say that probation and parole officers, folks, they have to navigate their systems. Okay? And deal with different personalities, different folks the same way we do. Okay? So having that empathy, figuring out how to collaborate, recognizing that there may be sometimes we can't collaborate. Sometimes times it's successful, sometimes it's not, but do we still keep trying? That's the key. Okay. I see some head nods, so I'm hoping I'm connecting on some level. Again, I could talk about this all day. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move us forward because we've got some time. This is community providers recognize and address the issues that may contribute to disparities in both behavioral health care and the criminal justice system. Now I think I have another presentation in person that's going to lean more into this in regards to equity, diversity, et cetera. And so we cannot take away the impact of this for justice involved folk. We can't. Okay. So different populations based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, different levels of access to services experience disproportionate representation in the criminal justice system in America. Let's be clear about that. Okay. It's important for us to understand the structural biases to prevent the further perpetuation and interference with positive treatment and justice outcomes. I actually like that statement directly from Samsha. Okay, we cannot not have the conversation around inequity without talking, we can't not have that conversation as a part of this. But how do we prevent further perpetuation of it? Okay, is a part of our role in working with the population. So, kind of leaning into what have you heard in your work with justice involved clients? And I like to consider this because while we're talking about person-centered and it feels like it's very clinical, it feels like we're leaning into these, we're definitely leaning into relationships, we're leaning into concepts, right? We're leaning into collaboration, we're leaning into all of these things. We have to think about our role in this too. Okay, our role in this too. And so I'd like for folks to think about the following questions. And if you feel comfortable sharing some information about it, definitely feel free to put something in the chat or unmute. And so what have you heard are the most challenging aspects of work with justice involved clients? Do you believe that a practitioner's motivation and willingness to work with justice involved clients plays a role? And do you believe that role adequacy has a role to play in whether or not you want to work with justice involved clients? So that's us. Okay. I know it's taking a minute. I asked some deep questions there. I'm sorry. But it's stuff we have to look at.
I think that it totally has everything to do with your own, what you bring to the relationship yourself. I've been facilitating restorative justice workshops with some kids from a high school nearby in the Capital District, and it's either do this or they're not going back to school, and it's really rough doing these workshops because just getting them to be able to speak to each other without beating each other down is a whole thing in itself. But they keep coming back because we keep setting it up, and they broke the rules enough and violated our comfortableness as practitioners enough to have us be okay, you have to leave because they started hitting each other. But they were trying to negotiate ways of okay, we can just separate each other, we don't have to go, I came from downtown, I don't want to have to go catch the bus, so I think the fact that you are even there showing up for the person at all in the first place, it's you are showing somebody that there is at least one person that's there for them that actually cares, and you're gonna show up whether they want you to or not. And it develops kind of just this is how it's gonna be, and you have support whether you want to acknowledge it or not, and it's there if you want to take it.
Thank you for that.
The second one, I would say for that question, through my experience, when they see that practitioners or any providers are motivated, willingness to work with them, it makes everybody's jobs easier. You know what I mean? When I meet with a client and the therapist is not working with them, or the psychiatrist or the parole officer, we spend most of the time talking about that instead of talking about the goals, how we could be better, what we can do better, how we could set up their first initial appointment for a dentist, or their first initial appointment for physical for physical. So it's just, and I don't mind talking to them when they have problems, but it's just, you know, when everything is not cohesively working together, you spend a lot of more time trying to be the mediator between them and the providers.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? If that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. I see that Dennis, is that Dennis?
Yes, good morning. And
Hi, good morning.
looking at this first one and some of the challenging aspects, I think a lot of times we think that many of the people that are incarcerated are with an antisocial personality disorder, with a lack of empathy. And the other thing, key thing is, I work in a county jail delivering substance abuse services, and there's a difference between male and female populations too. So I think when we deal with people, we're dealing with people on a human level. I think in order to gain this thing called trust, we need to gain their respect and to meet them at their level. And I think at times, even though it's suggested otherwise, self-disclosure on my part seems to be very effective. But then again, it needs to be done in a therapeutic role, not in order to gain favor. So a lot of this, and I think I mentioned this before, a lot of them have trauma. And in order to uncover that trauma without demeaning the person is going through an innocent questionnaire called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And if you do that in a group setting, it just, if someone has the courage in order to disclose maybe some past secrets, because one of the characteristics of addiction is keeping secrets, it may lend other people in order to share a little bit more about their own personal life. And hopefully we can create an environment that's one, safe, emotionally, physically, and also in order for them to be assured that confidentiality is a key component. Because what's said in the group room doesn't, we have to make sure it doesn't go back to the housing unit. So there's a whole lot of different elements in order to connect with a person in order to do so. As far as own motivation and willingness to work with justice involved clients, it could be real or it could be a mask, but these people are trained to read people very well and discern whether or not that you're meeting them on a real level or not. So you have to try to be as real as possible in conveying that you're there in order to help them. So role adequacy, I don't know what that might be. Is it a perceived perception of?
Yep. Do you know how to do the work? Do you feel comfortable? Mhm. Do you feel comfortable working with the population? Do you feel like you have the skills necessary, the strategies necessary to work with the population?
I think that could be developed. I think the other elements that I just mentioned might be a little bit more important, and the role adequacy could be developed as you work with the client, justice involved client. There's a lot in order and packed into these questions. So thank you for this time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Other comments?
I wanted to share that Skip had put in the comments earlier about how it really is about cultural shift and about implementing justice peers, into probation, treatment centers, et cetera. That can really help. And your questions kind of remind me of the challenges faced when trying to introduce MAT into the hospital systems. There was a litany of reasons why they couldn't. A lot of stigmatizing languages in there, a lot of assumptions in there, but also real things like fatigue, like overwork. They didn't have space, really to learn about substance use disorder, that doctors weren't taught that in medical school, and that nurses, the little bit that they were taught, it wasn't as expansive to address a crisis that we were facing. And it wasn't until certified recovery peer advocates were implemented and they started seeing the immediate outcomes and lives saved and turned around that MAT really blossomed in all of the hospital systems, at least up here in the region. So I think that all of your questions really speak to that type of thing. You know, you have these pre-assumptions, you know, people may have about the clientele. And then, you know, you have to have that willingness to learn something new, but what do, you know, if you don't have that willingness from people? And then, you know, I do think that it does, play, you know, a critical role if you're able to include, and I kept on like driving that point home back then, is I wasn't trying to shift people's, you know, point of view or perception or their moral, you know, where they stand, because I know that just like a person, behavioral change, it's a process. So I couldn't believe that that would, you know, just be from a couple of hours of me sharing that they would do that. But what I did expect is that they would want to use the latest and greatest evidence-based information to address their clientele, like they did with all their other population. And I think that's like another angle, is this is another tool, another resource, another way to help you assist your clients, your fellow humans, of reaching the goals that not only they want to meet, but that you want to see them meet, and that you're frustrated because you haven't seen them meet.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Other folk? I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay. So one of the key factors, again, this is my passion, one of the key factors actually is folks feeling like they could do the work. So motivation and willingness has a role, absolutely, to play, but it's almost like the practice. I can do the work. That's the biggest thing that impacts folks really engaging with justice-involved folks. Can I do this? Do I feel comfortable in doing this? Can I move past potential, as Carrie mentioned, stigma and bias, and do this work and be present? And I wanted to go back something, I think that it was Hayden mentioned. I think, forgive me if I'm incorrect. You mentioned being in the room. Even if you don't want to acknowledge I'm in the room, even if you don't want to acknowledge my support, I'm here, right? That's the motivation and willingness to work with a fellow human being. Okay. And all of that has a role to play in our work with justice-involved clients. Okay. Because we can learn all the amazing techniques and all of that, but it's, what do we do with that? What do we do with it? Okay. And we do that through practice. Okay. Practice. Okay. So, let's see where I'm at. Okay. So, building an alliance with clients, and some of this, again, feels like this may be a reminder, but part of the beauty of this and other opportunities is that you're reminded of some things. Some folks learn some new stuff. That's all a part of this process. And so I talked about this a little earlier, addressing the client's feelings about the treatment mandate early in the alliance. Don't try not to ignore this, because it's in the room. Okay, so part of what we can do is create a space for there to be a real conversation about what this looks like. How does it feel, etc. Sit with sit with it and process the spectrum of emotions that may come out for the client who is being told, you need to come here. Okay, there's a lot of emotions connected to that, and not feeling like we have to deconstruct it and make folks feel better. It's first creating a space where folks feel comfortable in saying these things. Okay, it's okay that I'm angry. It's okay that I'm pissed off that I have to come here every week. Okay, and then subsequently kind of work through that process of how do we get to the other side of that anger? Can we? What are some other things we can do together, etc. So it's normalizing the spectrum of feelings that the client may express and not taking it personally as best we can. Okay, because someone being angry about being told that they have to do something is a very normal emotion. And ultimately at the end, when you filter this all down, that's what that is. Okay. Discussing the treatment goals that may be beyond just the completion of a mandate, if there is a mandate in place. Okay, so you're here. I just want to get through this. Are there other things that we can work on together? Okay, are there other things we can work on together? And really remembering to kind of being thoughtful and transparent about your role and the role of the mandating entity. Okay. And so when we talk about what is some treatment tasks, we're talking about building a non-judgmental, empathic, healing therapeutic alliance with the client, leaning into their ambivalence about any changes, because we all have ambivalence around changes. All right. Identification of the goals addressing all of the stressors that potential people, that folks may have, what they feel comfortable in addressing, and not just focusing on the requirements of the mandating entity. Okay. Enhancing folks' self-management skill and developing a personalized, person-centered plan for positive changes. Okay. So what does this look like beyond that mandate or beyond I'm being told to come here? There's so many things that can be embedded into this person-centered process that we're engaging with justice involved clients. It could be housing, it could be transportation, education, training, community activities, friendships, relationships, helping them rebuild family relationships. All of it's something that can be discussed. All of it's something that we can help with. Okay, if the client is there. And when I mean there, they're ready to lean into those areas, okay? Because we also have to recognize that folks come in, I just want to get through this, okay? What else can we do? Okay. So key points to consider, and we kind of talked about this throughout our time together, is being prepared for this spectrum of responses from not just the mandating entity, but the individual collaborator that you're working with around the philosophy as it relates to treatment, case management, etc. So we have the larger systems, then we have the individual people in the systems. So being prepared for the spectrum of responses, okay? Recognition of reframing necessary during reporting to mandated entities about treatment progress, compliance with mandates, etc. And one of the examples is a toxicology question. Okay, so there are other things that we need to have that real conversation with folks around and really lean into what we do and what we can't do. Okay. Being prepared to include the mandating entity in case conferencing. That also includes the client. Again, we discussed this, the transparency of having those case conferences that everyone is included. Okay, as best we can, because there's also the component that we need to look at while we're talking about community supervision and we're talking about folks navigating systems. This also may look very different if someone is working inside a jail or a prison. Okay, if someone is working inside a jail or a prison, there are different considerations that need to be on the table. Okay, so we need to acknowledge that as well. And being prepared for advocacy moments and working with the client to navigate systems. Okay, we may not be able to change the system. We may not be able to change that individual person, but our responsibility is being prepared for those moments where we can advocate. And advocating with the client. I think, Veronica, the example that you mentioned where the client left the room and you had the conversation with the client and then you spoke to the psychiatrist and circled back.
Yes, ma'am.
That was a perfect example. Perfect example. And we also see an example of someone hearing that and saying, okay, I need to change the way that I'm working with the client. And the client coming back, because you created that space, and saying, you know what, it's gotten better. That's the complete circle that we're talking about here. Okay. So this is a question I'm going to leave people with. Okay, I'm going to leave folks with, which are what are some of the potential challenges in implementing and maintaining person-centered treatment with your justice-involved clients? Because each of you registered for this for a reason, right? You're either working with justice-involved clients or you would like to work with justice-involved clients, right? We can talk all of this. We can talk about relationships. We can talk about person-centered. We can talk about it. But what's the real life potential challenges to all of this? And we've talked about some of them, right? Which is
a challenge for one person-centered treatment, because person-centered treatment is about the person, about their treatment, what's going to help them. But I think one of the challenges is, especially when it's mandated, that's the problem. It's that word. It's that word that comes across negative. It's a negative acronym that when you say that word, it triggers that client. So person-centered really don't go with mandation, but we made it go with it. You know what I mean? If that making sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is not only triggering to the client, it is potentially triggering to the provider, because when we hear that word, what do we think about the client? Let's not take ourselves out of this equation, okay? And what does the entity feel like that mandate means?
And it probably and I didn't think about that. We got to call ourselves out too, because when somebody's mandate, when I first worked in care management, I worked with regular care management where people was voluntarily had to be part of the program. They didn't have to meet with you. When I moved to another county, because I had bought a new house last year, I transferred to that county. They said, you want to try AOT? Where these clients are mandated. So in my head, I did feel like, oh, this is going to be easy. They got to see me. They're mandated to see me. This is just so easier. So I did have that judgmental about them, that judgmental and that bias. So I ain't gonna lie about that.
And thank you for admitting that, because we can't not make that a part of this conversation. This whole philosophy of who's a voluntary client, who's an involuntary client, who's a mandated client, all the different nomenclature that's attached to that. Okay, and what we think, because I can tell you there are a number of folks who believe that once a client is mandated, they lack motivation, they had to be told to come here. There's all of these different stigmatizing statements that are made. And so we need to acknowledge our role in this as well. Carrie, did you see something in the chat?
Yes, I was just reading back a few that I had missed that are talking about healthy boundaries, and how critically that's important. We're talking a lot about the type of support, that we can provide, and also, train up and learn more and more about how to provide that support. But you also really need to have a good, if not a great understanding of your own healthy boundaries. And so I was just about to excitingly type to Hayden, but to everyone too, will be in the final chat about, I hope you can join us for the Professional Boundaries in-person event that we're having on March 19th. We can really expand on that that concept, because it's true. He was mentioning compassion fatigue, in particular. But there was also some other comments from folks that also spoke to that, and the many needs that are put upon supporting somebody, and the feelings that you might have of inadequacy is, how do I support someone with all of these appointments and treatments and et cetera that are set up when that person's looking at it, like setting them up to fail. And, what role do I play, and how do I address so much? And so I just think that, Hayden, thank you that they hit it on the head when they talked about, the healthy boundaries and about compassion fatigue, that you got to be protective of yourself too, because obviously everyone on this call is very passionate about this subject area, but that passion can also lead to fatigue. So being protective of yourself is important too, and self-care.
And when we talk about, I mean, and I'm just going to throw, again, this is just a seed for folks to think about. We can talk about, we've talked about a lot of, or you're processing some things, but not every interaction with a justice involved client is going to be positive. And how do we process that? How do we process when in the thought process of self-determination that someone is making choices that may unfortunately lead to them being violated or reincarcerated? Okay, that's all something that we need to lean into as well. Okay, so this is why this is not a one-time conversation. This is something that you have to lean into consistently. Okay, and I'm using the word violated. Okay, which ugh, I hate that word, but it's a word that is a part of the terminology for parole. Okay. So I hope that I was able to plant some seeds, water some seeds, remind some seeds that were already there, etc., of things that you can consider in working with the population. But again, this is not a one-time thing. And so it's something that you will definitely need to consider, reconsider, look at where you are in doing this work, because that also has a role to play. Where you're located, are you outpatient? Are you working in the community? Are you in the jail system and the prison system, etc.? That also has a role to play. And there's also there's a whole other different spectrum of how that looks, and how do you do this in those systems. But beginning to think about it and think about your role, what you need to do to feel more comfortable about your work, but also how do you take care of yourself in this work? Okay. So as we move forward to our time, I wanted to open it up to any feedback and questions, but also while I have it open, I'm going to move us to the quick survey that Carrie talked about in the beginning that you can scan to your phone, and it'll take you directly to the feedback survey. Take care of yourselves and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all so much. Take care, everyone.